4 years ago, I was finishing up writing a book that eventually became The New Alberta Advantage: Technology, Policy, and the Future of the Oil Sands. In that book, I argued that oil sands CEOs got climate change and that they were prepared to decarbonize their very emissions intense sector. Then a year ago, the five of the companies came together and formed the Oil Sands Net Zero by 2050 Pathways Alliance. So what has been accomplished in those 4 years? Well, pretty much nothing. And I'm going to talk to Jan Gorski, who is the director of the Pembina Institute's oil and gas program, about a new report waiting to launch: the gap between Canadian oil sands companies, climate pledges, and actions. So welcome to the interview, Jan.
Thanks, Markham. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Look, I'm very happy to have you here today. Well, actually, I'm unhappy to have you here today because we shouldn't be talking about this. I was once an optimist. I am no longer an optimist. I have lost a considerable amount of faith in the oil sands companies. And as somebody remarked today on one of my Twitter feeds, the oil sands companies have made themselves into bad faith actors. They say they make all sorts of promises, they talk a good game, and it does not appear that they are legitimate and that they're sincere, and we shouldn't take their words at face value. Given the report that you've written, what's your take on that?
Yeah, so we tried to examine that exact same question, to look at the differences between their words and their actions. And what we found, as you said, the pathways were established about a year ago. And we haven't seen the kind of progress that we'd expect on the pledges that were made a year ago. So I would hope to see more details on the carbon capture projects. What facilities will they be taking place at? What are the timelines? I would hope to see more details on some of the other things that the oil sands can do, because we have to remember, carbon capture and storage isn't the only opportunity here. There's easier things that they can do, that they can make quicker progress on: energy efficiency, electrification, fuel switching. And we haven't seen any details on that either. And we haven't seen investment decisions on either one of these. And I think it's fair to say CCUS, those are longer term projects, but some of this other stuff, companies can be moving on much faster.
Well, that's right. And I think it's fair to say that there are things that can be done. Now, you put out a report 2-3 months ago, because I interviewed you about it, in which you said the federal oil and gas emissions cap is doable. They can hit their targets, the 2030 targets. And the point you made in there that I thought was really good was that the industry, including the oil sands, can raise its methane emissions ambitions. It was at 40 to 45% a few years ago, and then the federal government raised it to 75%. And you argue that it could be even much higher yet. That way they can take that's low-hanging fruit. They could do that while they're putting in place these other things like energy efficiency, converting their pet coke boilers to cogen, and building CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage infrastructure. The things that the stuff they can do in the short term, stuff they can do in the long term, they haven't even started the short term stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fair point. And I mean, we should make the distinction that the Pathways Alliance is focused just on oil sands, and oil sands doesn't have that methane mitigation potential. But the companies that are part of that alliance, Cenovus and CNRL specifically, they have significant conventional assets where there is a pretty big methane opportunity.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, thank you for clarifying that point. And another issue that you raise in this report is the fact that over the last couple of years, the industry has been making record profits. So the oil sands is now producing a record amount of bitumen. And the companies that are making record profits, but instead of investing some of that money in decarbonization, what they're doing is giving anywhere from 75 to 100% of it back to shareholders in the form of higher dividends and share buybacks. And
Mhm.
And I should point out, at the same time, two of the CEOs that are in the Pathways Alliance, Mark Little, who was the Suncor CEO up until recently, and Alex Pourbet, who's the CEO of Cenovus, have publicly said we need $50 billion from governments in order to do the CCUS. So they're making money hand over fist. They're literally printing money, and at the same time they're going with their hands out to governments to fund 2/3 of their decarbonization. It's a huge bill. I don't know how to reconcile it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a very unique boom in a historical context, because what we're seeing is companies are making record profits, but they're not reinvesting those record profits into producing more. In past booms, what we would have seen is they would have given some of that money to investors, and they would have reinvested some of that in their own business in the form of increasing production. That production increase isn't happening right now, potentially because investors are kind of seeing the long-term trends. They're seeing all the action on climate, and they see some uncertainty in continued growth and demand for oil. So they might be a little hesitant. But what I would expect, as we say in the report, is there's different ways to invest in the business. It's still fair to give some money back to your shareholders, but that balance isn't there. They could be reinvesting in their business by funding some of these decarbonization measures, reducing emissions. And we're not seeing that. We're not seeing that in the financial statements.
Well, and you make the point in the report that not only are we not seeing the investments, we're not even seeing them talking about plans. Now, and I have to say at this point, there is one exception, and I'm a bit of a Suncor fan because they do these kinds of things. But the company has committed in its last investor presentation, which covers 5 years out to 2027, that they will cut their absolute emissions from 29 megatons a year to 19 megatons a year. That will be the first absolute decline in oil sands emissions that we've ever seen. And the company has a plan to do it. Part of it is investing in the base camp, their cogen project, and they've allocated the capital to do that. But even still, I would argue that Suncor does not have the same sense of urgency that is required, and the other companies have no sense of urgency whatsoever. They just think that they're going to be allowed to go on like this forever, it appears.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Suncor's plan is credible, but it's worth noting, and it's 10 megatons is nothing to sneeze at, but it's worth noting in there that a good chunk of those emissions are outside of their direct operations, and we talked about this in our report, in that a lot of those reductions are from a wind plant that they're building that they're subsequently planning on divesting from.
Right. Yeah, fair enough. They've got a number of renewable projects, wind and solar, they're going to be divesting from. Now, there's yet another wrinkle to this, and that is that the industry, including the oil sands companies, at the very time that they should have greater urgency around decarbonization, are actually pushing back hard. We see it in their trade associations. We see it in the company's public statements about, oh my God, we can't get our emissions down like that. These regulations the targets are too unreasonable. We can't do that. So when I see no action, giving all of their capital back, that at least some of it should go into decarbonization, but isn't being given back to shareholders, no plans, and cranking up the PR and media campaign against the emissions reductions, that to me is the very definition of bad faith actor.
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that certainly we're seeing a discrepancy here in that these companies made these plans last year, over a year ago, before we even had a commitment to a cap, before we had a commitment to the investment tax credit released even. And now there are significant incentives on the table. We have the investment tax credit for carbon capture and storage. We have credits through the clean fuel regulation. We have carbon offsets. The government is working on this carbon contract for differences to provide certainty for the carbon price. So we have a pretty robust policy environment and incentive environment for these companies to take action. And you kind of have to choose. If you say you're committed to net zero and committed to making these reductions, then you have to move forward along that path.
Right. And there's another incentive here that we haven't talked about, and that is the fact that the carbon price is currently $50 a ton. Well, under the output-based pricing system, they only pay 10 to 20% of that. So they, do they need the incentive of maybe being charged 100% of that carbon price, especially since it's scheduled to go up to $170 a ton by 2030? I mean, if government isn't going to start laying on, bringing out the sticks and applying them to these companies like that, what else are we to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're right that the carbon pricing, this carbon pricing system was designed to protect competitiveness. But to your point, that's why we need the oil and gas cap. I mean, we need an overarching policy that will hold these companies accountable to their own commitments.
I would agree. So who's going to hold them accountable, Jan? The provincial government has policy tools, and it has chosen and said it's not going to apply any of those. The federal government was talking big and brought in the emission oil and gas, or at least it proposed a couple of ways it had a discussion paper around the oil and gas emissions cap. There was going to be, could be a cap and trade, or maybe it could be carbon tax to impose the cap. Now that seems to be getting softer, and the deadlines or the time frame seems to be getting softer. And there's a lot of speculation that it was because of lobbying from the industry, especially the oil sands companies. So if government isn't going to do it, and do it in, or at least do it in a timely fashion, are there any other alternatives?
Well, I would say I haven't given up hope on the oil and gas cap. I mean, I think that policy is still moving forward. Maybe not on the timelines that we hope, but certainly they're progressing. And I think that the federal government needs to move quickly following these consultations and put something on the table around what that oil and gas cap is going to look like. But the other players that have a really big say here is the investors. I mean, they're a pretty key stakeholder. They can hold these companies accountable.
Well, is that a likely possibility then, that we might see activist investors, the kind that have dogged some of the big oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil? I mean, is that maybe? I don't know if it's even a reasonable expectation, because I'm not aware of much activism with the Canadian companies.
I think it's an emerging space. I mean, that example of Exxon is a really important one to show that there are now stakeholders that are part of these investment communities that are really pushing for strong actions and trying to hold these companies to account. This is a really emerging space, but I think investors are starting to wake up to this and starting to become more aware of these issues and challenges.
Well, I hope you're right, Jan, because now the shoe is on the other foot. You're the optimistic one, and I'm the pessimist, and have essentially lost patience with these companies. So I guess we'll monitor this and see what the governments, particularly the federal government, finally decides it's going to do about this issue. But clearly, I think we can both agree something has to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're hoping to see some more plans and some more details come out of these commitments.
Thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Markham. Always a pleasure to be on.